When you're studying, it helps to reduce your lecture notes to an outline. So add sketches or diagrams wherever possible, particularly ones that you've drawn. So labeling is great, and putting in diagrams from the notes are great, but adding your own drawings of this and drawing out the mechanisms was really helpful. This helps you boost memory and prioritize information. So today we're into chapter 18, it's part 2 of the digestive system. And we're going to talk about some of the accessory organs that are part of this system. Okay, so we're going to start with the liver. Here's the microscopic anatomy of the liver. And remember that the liver is producing bile and then storing it in the gallbladder. Okay. Additionally, all the blood from the digestive tract goes to the liver to be cleaned. Okay, so we have these branches of bile ductwork here, as well as hepatic arteries and other blood vessels that go here too. And coming towards the central vein through the liver. And this, the hepatic portal vein, hepatic artery, and the bile duct are called the portal triad because they are feeding and taking things to and from the liver. Here's a closer look at that, where you have a branch of the portal vein, the bile ductule, and the hepatic artery branch, again, all moving towards this central vein here. Okay. The liver has a lot of important jobs. The first one is bile production and secretion. And bile are bile salts, cholesterol, lecithin, and bilirubin. Okay, that are going to help you do things like break down fat from your diet. So specifically, their job is to remove heme and emulsify fat. So emulsification is this process of breaking down fat into smaller pieces, which creates more surface area than for the enzymes to actually break down fat. So it's the first breakdown of fat is initiated by this bile. Here's the process of emulsification. Imagine we have a big fat globule, and the bile salt then cuts it up into smaller pieces so that these enzymes then can attach to and emulsify the bile salts. Okay. So the bile production and secretion is bilirubin. Free bilirubin contains heme and is hydrophobic, meaning it's fat soluble. It becomes conjugated in the liver and is hydrophilic, which makes it water soluble. And the intestine, bilirubin becomes urobilinogen. Okay, and this is excreted in feces or absorbed into blood and excreted in urine. And we can look at some of the circulation then through these systems also to the kidney. Okay, so imagine you have your liver here, the common bile duct. Here is bilirubin being converted to urobilinogen, eventually becoming that urobilinogen in feces. So we can measure this then as the production of what's happening with this process here, this conversion of bilirubin to that urobilinogen. Okay. We also see this showing up in urine. So you can get urine measurements and fecal measurements of this urobilinogen to look at this production and degradation system. Okay. So our second function of the liver is detoxification of the blood. And we excrete waste with bile. Now the process then has to convert toxic waste then into manageable waste. So ammonia is a toxic waste product that we produce, and that becomes urea. Hydrophobic drugs become hydrophilic, so they're easily excreted. So we get drug processing and waste processing then in the liver. This is how it's going to detoxify. The third function of the liver is to house macrophages. Fourth is the storage of glycogen, fat, iron, and fat-soluble vitamins. So we talk a lot about storage of glycogen, right? Producing glycogen from free glucose in the blood, but the liver also stores fat, iron, and fat-soluble vitamins. And finally, the liver makes plasma proteins. Okay. So next we're going to talk about the pancreas. Here's the pancreas, this organ in this first fold of the duodenum in the small intestine. And the pancreas is really important. We'll talk about it enzymatically today in terms of its exocrine function. We'll get to endocrine function. We talked about endocrine function previously. We talked about insulin and glucagon production from the pancreas. And so it's kind of nested, and the bile duct goes right on top of the pancreas where it enters then into the duodenum. Okay. So here's our pancreas. The pancreas also has a duct here that empties into the small intestine and empties into this duodenum. And if we look a little bit closer, we're going to see the different structures, right? So the pancreatic islet of Langerhans, these are the ones that are producing insulin and glucagon. And the pancreatic acinus, that's the one that is producing the exocrine portion, so the digestive enzymes that go into that duodenum. The gallbladder is an organ that stores bile between meals. And excess cholesterol can crystallize and form gallstones. So the liver produces the bile and the gallbladder is storing the bile. If this crystallizes and becomes gallstones, this can be very painful because these can block the common bile duct. And so you can get spasms and other pain in that area then if you're not able to move things through the common bile duct. The pancreas's job is to add secretions to the small intestine. Duct cells release sodium bicarbonate. So this is a major function of the pancreas, is that, remember, the chyme coming from your stomach is going to be really acidic, right? It's going to be a pH of 2 or 3 because you added stomach acid, hydrochloric acid, to it in the stomach. And now when it enters the small intestine, we need to neutralize that and bring it back to a more neutral place. So duct cells in the pancreas release sodium bicarbonate to raise that pH. It actually gets a little bit basic here too, so you can raise it to a pH of about 7 to 8. The acinar cells in the pancreas release 3 enzymes that are important in digestion. The first is pancreatic amylase that digests carbohydrates. The second one is trypsin, which deals with proteins, and the third one is lipase that deals with lipids. So these are going to be all enzymes that are going to affect our food molecules. Most enzymes from the pancreas are released as inactive zymogens, and they actually become active in the intestine. So they're released as an inactive member, and they become active when they hit the intestine. Okay, so recall that we have some hormones to worry about in terms of function. These are the ones that are in the stomach, and then we're going to add a couple that come from the small intestine. Okay, so we talked about gastrin before, that is made in the G cells in the stomach. And it stimulates the stomach production, particularly acid production. Somatostatin, made in D cells of the stomach, inhibits stomach actions. Then we have 2 new hormones to think about. One is called CCK, cholecystokinin, that's made in the duodenum, and it also inhibits the stomach. And glucagon-like peptide 1, made in the small intestine, inhibits the stomach. So we have 3 ways in which we can inhibit stomach acid production, okay? And this is really important to regulate the amount of acid in the stomach. Once food is transferred into the small intestine, you don't want to have acid produced in the stomach anymore because now the chyme has moved on. And so this helps protect the stomach from producing acid when the stomach is empty. So there's 3 phases of gastric function. And in our first phase of gastric function, we have what's called a cephalic phase. So this is before food enters the digestive tract. This is the point where you are seeing, smelling, or tasting food. Okay, this allows you to prepare for the onset of food. And the cephalic phase turns on the vagus nerve. So when you see, smell, or taste food, that vagus nerve gets turned on, and you start to have stomach secretions. In the gastric phase, the food is in the stomach. That causes more secretions. And in the intestinal phase, the chyme in the duodenum causes stomach to slow. So cephalic phase and gastric phase, we are ramping up and using the stomach to make acid there. And then when food moves into the intestine, that's the intestinal phase where you're going to turn off stomach acid so as to not damage your tissues. Okay. In the pancreas, the duct cells are stimulated by secretin from the duodenum, which is the result of, and that results in sodium bicarbonate release. So that hormone secretin from the duodenum tells the pancreas to make that sodium bicarbonate to neutralize the acid. And the acinar cells are stimulated by CCK from the duodenum. And the result is pancreatic enzymes are released. So these hormones can have actions in the stomach and actions in the pancreas. Both secretin and CCK stimulate bile release. Now we're going to talk about the different kinds of food components we have and how they are digested and absorbed. And the first one is carbohydrates. Digestion of carbohydrates begins in your mouth with salivary amylase. Then pancreatic amylase in the small intestine takes over and continues to break down the carbohydrates once the chyme enters the small intestine. Then the brush border enzymes of the intestinal microvilli are activated. And after this point, simple sugars can be transported across the epithelial cells, across that mucosa of the intestinal wall and into the blood capillaries in the submucosa. For proteins, we have digestion with pepsin in the stomach. Then trypsin, chymotrypsin, and elastase from the pancreas work on proteins as well. Another enzyme, carboxypeptidase from the pancreas, and aminopeptidase. So lots of different enzymes are required to break down protein. What you'll note is that we've got trypsin and we've got these peptidase hormones, okay? And once those all act on the proteins, then amino acids are transported into the blood just like the sugars. Finally, for fats, we have initial emulsification with bile, and then digestion with pancreatic lipase. Okay, and this breaks it into monoglycerides and free fatty acids. Those subunits then are absorbed into epithelial cells, the microvilli, and reorganized with proteins. So we can get things like chylomicron. The chylomicrons then go into the lymph, not into the blood. Okay, so here's a picture of this. Our thoracic duct, the lacteal and the thoracic duct, and the chylomicrons then coming from the lumen of the small intestine going into these lacteal lymph system ducts, okay? So here's the triglyceride, your major fatty component. Bile salts and lipase are breaking them down into free fatty acids and monoglycerides. Then those things are going to come together, form triglycerides in your cells, and finally form these chylomicrons that go into the lymphatic system. Lipoproteins carry fats throughout the blood, and we come up with these when we hear about LDL and HDL. So the low density lipoproteins transport lipids to tissues to be stored, whereas high density lipoproteins, HDL, transport lipids to the liver to be degraded. And here's why we think of them as good cholesterol and bad cholesterol, is that the good cholesterol takes those lipids to the liver to be degraded. So you get less fat accumulation then due to these HDL levels. The LDLs, though, essentially tell you to transport lipids to tissues to be stored. And so you end up with more than fatty accumulation than in tissues because of this LDL. Okay. So let's think through some examples. Irene experiences a sharp pain in her upper right abdomen after eating a high-fat meal. Also, she has noted that her feces are grayish-white instead of brown. What is the most likely cause of her symptoms? And then I want you to explain why each of these symptoms occurs with this condition. Okay. And don't forget, if you want the answers to these and you want to talk through them with me, please come to office hours so we can talk about the results. Okay? All right, I'll see you all next time.